Today's story is one that lingers, the kind that settles deep under your skin, set in the unforgiving silence of the Wild West. This was a land where danger hid behind every ridge, where a wrong turn could mean death, and where destiny often arrived disguised as disaster. It began with a stolen horse and a gathering storm, a moment that seemed ordinary, yet would change 2 lives forever. Before we kick off this adventure, don't forget to hit like on the video and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. When we think back on our early 20s, we often laugh at how certain we once were. Back then, we believed our lives followed a clean, dependable trail. We were convinced we knew who we would marry, where we would settle, and the kind of people we were destined to become. We held on to that imagined future like a hand-drawn map, gripping it tight, afraid that one wrong step might ruin everything. But time teaches a harsher truth. Life, like a desert river, almost never runs straight. A map is only ink on paper. Sometimes floodwaters rise beneath a clear sky. Sometimes the bridge you trusted collapses the moment your boots touch it. And it's in those moments, standing knee-deep in mud, that we finally discover who we truly are. That detour isn't always failure. Often it's where life was trying to take us all along. This story belongs to 2 young souls who believed they knew their direction. One was a young woman fleeing a gilded cage, gasping for her first breath of freedom. The other was a warrior riding straight toward conflict, bearing the survival of his people on his shoulders. They were never meant to cross paths, but the high desert has a way of mocking our plans and leading us exactly where we're needed. This is how their storm began. It wasn't the wind that warned her first. It was the silence, that heavy, unnatural stillness that settles over the desert moments before the land breaks open. Elowyn Price knew that silence well. She'd grown up reading the sky like scripture, but today, she wasn't watching the clouds. She was looking behind her. At 24 years old, she was running for her life. Beneath her, the stolen mare, long-legged and wild-eyed, was slick with sweat, her chest pumping hard like a bellows. Elowyn was no horse thief by nature. Just 2 days earlier, she'd been an engaged woman. She'd worn silk, sat in shaded parlors in Tucson, sipped tea beside a man who smiled with his lips, but never with his eyes. A man who didn't see a partner in her, only property meant to be displayed and controlled. Then she saw the bruise on her maid's arm, left there by his temper. In that mark, Elowyn saw her own future written plain as ink. So she ran. No trunk, no farewell. She took a small paring knife from the kitchen, a satchel of dried apples, and the fastest horse in the paddock. Now the Tucson Valley lay miles behind her, but fear still rode in the saddle beside her. Every snapping twig sounded like pursuit. Every shadow felt like a rider closing in. She urged the mare up a narrow deer trail, mesquite branches tearing at her skirts. The air shifted without warning. The baking afternoon heat vanished, replaced by a crushing pressure that made her ears throb. Then came the smell, sharp, metallic, ozone, and wet sage carried on the wind. Elowyn lifted her eyes. The sky had darkened into a deep, bruised purple, swollen and heavy. Clouds stacked against the mountains like an anvil, black underneath, blinding white at their crests. A monsoon was forming. Out here, among broken canyons and ancient stone, a storm didn't mean rain. It meant destruction. 5 miles east, beyond a granite ridge, Tarek was studying the same sky. But weather was the last thing on his mind. At 26, he was broad-shouldered and battle-hardened, shaped by years of tracking and survival. Yet today, he was not riding to fight. Pressed against his chest beneath deerskin lay a fragile promise. A treaty meant to prevent bloodshed between the Stonewind people and the Lowell Border Troop. The future of his people rested on that paper. He guided his horse through scrub oak, eyes sweeping the ridgeline. As a scout, he trusted the land, listened to its warnings. But the wind rose suddenly, howling hard enough to swallow sound. There was no call, no warning, no chance to speak. Only the sharp crack of a rifle splitting the afternoon. Tarek felt the impact before he heard it, fire ripping through his thigh. His horse screamed, rearing violently before bolting away. He hit the rocks hard, rolling on instinct, teeth clenched against the pain. Iron Hollow men, mercenaries, men who didn't believe in treaties or peace, only in the money paid for dark hair. Another bullet tore dust from the ground inches from his face. Tarek dragged himself into the brush, his wounded leg useless beneath him. His rifle was gone, still strapped to the horse now vanishing into the canyon. All he had left was his knife. He slid down the steep bank into a dry wash carved by centuries of floods, a narrow stone throat with no escape. Above him, boots crunched closer. Voices shouted. He pressed himself beneath the roots of an ironwood tree, one hand clamped over his bleeding leg. Then the sky broke open. Rain didn't fall. It slammed down sideways, cold and violent. Dust turned to mud in seconds. The temperature dropped like a knife. Blinded and cursing, the Iron Hollow men turned back toward higher ground. Tarek was spared the hunters, but not the flood. Water crept through the wash. A trickle became a surge. He knew what followed next. A wall of water, gathering miles away, racing straight toward him. His vision blurred. Fever crept in fast. The world tilted as the rain hammered his face. He lay back in the sand and waited for the end. Then he felt it. Not thunder. Hooves. Elowen rode blind through the storm. Ember slipped on wet stone, panicked and skittish. She had lost the trail. North and south meant nothing now. Lightning tore the peaks apart as Ember plunged into the wash. Elowen screamed, then she saw him. A dark figure slumped beneath twisted roots. A man. Her first instinct was terror. But this man wore buckskin. His long black hair clung to his face. Not the man she fled from. A warrior. The water climbed fast around his boots. He didn't move. He looked at her, eyes dulled with pain. Not an enemy, just a man dying in the mud. Elowen swallowed hard. She could still escape. Instead, she pulled the reins. "Easy," she whispered, then slid from the saddle. Mud swallowed her boots as she ran to him. "Get up," she shouted over the storm. "You have to move." "I can't," he rasped. "You will," she said, and hauled him up anyway. The flood roared closer. Together they fought toward Ember, and the desert made its choice. Below him, the wash lay empty, nothing but loose sand and scattered stone. Tarek pressed his body tight against the twisted roots of an ancient ironwood. One hand clamped hard over the wound in his thigh, trying to slow the blood. He was no longer the hunter. He was the hunted. He closed his eyes for a moment, listening. The men were close. Too close. And then the sky answered in his favor. It began with a single drop. Cold. Heavy. Striking his skin like a bead of glass. Then another. And then the world split open. The rain did not fall gently. It came sideways, hurled by the wind like iron nails. Gray sheets crashed down, blinding and relentless. Dust vanished beneath it, turning instantly to sucking mud. The temperature dropped in a heartbeat. High on the ridge, the Iron Hollow men shouted curses, squinting through the downpour, unable to see, unable to track. They wheeled their horses and rode for shelter. Tarek was spared from men, but not from what came next. He tried to push himself upright, His leg gave way. Pain exploded white-hot through his body. He collapsed back into the sand. Water was already creeping toward him. First a thin ribbon, then a rushing stream, brown, churning, alive. He knew what followed. A wall of water gathering miles away, charging straight down the canyon throat. He dragged himself a few desperate feet. His vision smeared at the edges. Heat crawled through his blood as fever climbed fast. Rain soaked him to the bone. Cold battled fire inside his body. The ground spun beneath him. Finally, he lay flat on his back, rain striking his face without mercy, and he let go. Then he felt it, not the growl of water. Hooves. Elowen Price was riding blind. Ember panicked beneath her, hooves skidding on slick stone. The trail was gone. North and south had vanished. The world had become nothing but roaring gray. She loosened the reins and trusted the mare's instinct, letting Ember search for lower ground, away from lightning splitting the peaks. The horse plunged down a slope, slipping hard on her haunches, and crashed straight into the wash. Elowen screamed as Ember stumbled. They had dropped directly into the flood's path. She hauled back on the reins, trying to force the mare toward the opposite bank. That was when she saw him. A dark shape crouched beneath the tangled roots of a tree. A man. Fear hit her first, sharp and instinctive. Him. The man she was running from. But no. This man wore buckskin. His long black hair clung to his face, plastered there by rain. A warrior. Her knuckles went white around the reins. Every story she'd ever heard, every warning whispered in Tucson parlors screamed in her ears. Run. He is the enemy. Save yourself. The water climbed higher, swirling around the man's boots. He did not move. He looked up at her, eyes dark and fixed, clouded with pain. In that moment, he was not a warrior. He was simply a man dying in the mud. Elowen glanced at the rising water, then at the path to safety. Move, she told herself. Go. But she didn't drive Ember forward. Her gaze dropped to his hand, pressed tightly against his leg. Blood poured through his fingers, mixing with rain. She swore under her breath, a word no proper lady was meant to know, and yanked back on the reins. Whoa, easy. She slid from the saddle. Mud swallowed her boots at once. Rain soaked her dress, dragging it heavy against her legs as she fought toward him. Get up, she shouted over the wind. You have to get up. Tarek blinked, struggling to focus on the figure standing above him. A woman. A vision. She seized his arm, her grip far stronger than it looked. I can't, he rasped, his voice torn away by the storm. You will, she shouted back. She hooked her arm beneath his shoulder and hauled. I am not leaving you here to drown. She pulled, and Tarek groaned, the sound ripping free from deep in his chest. He was heavy, all broad shoulders and solid muscle. Elowen clenched her teeth, driving her heels into the shifting sand as she strained against his weight. The water reached her ankles now, icy and grasping, tugging with frightening force. Help me, she ordered. Something inside him answered. Tarek dragged his good leg beneath him, driven by instinct older than thought. Together they lurched toward the mare. Ember sidestepped wildly, eyes rolling, trembling at the storm and the sharp scent of blood. Easy, girl, easy, Elowen whispered, her voice breaking as the wind tore the words away. She shoved him toward the saddle. Grab the horn. Pull. His hand rose, shaking violently, and closed around the leather. With Elowen pushing from behind and Tarek hauling with the last of his strength, he dragged his upper body across the saddle. He couldn't mount. He simply hung there, sprawled across Ember's back like a sack of grain. There was no time to fix it. Elowen seized the bridle. The canyon roared now, a thunderous howl like a freight train made of rock and water racing toward them. "Go!" she shouted, slapping Ember's flank as she scrambled alongside, clutching the stirrup leather. The mare surged forward, hooves clawing at the muddy bank, slipping and striking stone. They crested the wash just as the flood arrived. A massive brown wall of water exploded through the channel, churning and violent, snapping trees like matchsticks and swallowing the ground where they'd stood seconds earlier. Spray slammed into them, freezing, brutal. Elowen collapsed onto the soaked grass, gasping as fire tore through her lungs. Ember stood nearby, shivering, head low and sides heaving. Tarek slid from the saddle and hit the ground hard, unconscious. Elowen dropped to her knees and crawled to him, rain plastering her hair to her face. She brushed the wet strands from his forehead. His skin burned beneath her fingers, fever hot despite the cold rain. She lifted her eyes. The storm was settling in for the night. No stars, no moon, only endless rain and a vast, unfamiliar darkness pressing in from all sides. She was soaked, freezing, alone in the wilderness with a dying man. She was supposed to hate him. Yet as she checked his pulse, feeling that faint, steady beat beneath her fingertips, fear drained away. In its place rose something she hadn't known she carried. A quiet strength. "All right," she whispered to the unconscious man. "All right, we're not dying tonight." They found refuge in a narrow crack of limestone high above the canyon floor. It wasn't much, only a shallow cave that smelled of dust and ancient earth. But it was dry, and as the sky continued to tear itself apart outside, dryness felt like a miracle. Elowen dragged him the final 50 yards, unsure where the strength came from, adrenaline, stubbornness, or sheer refusal to let the desert claim them. When she finally collapsed onto the stone floor, her lungs burned like they were filled with shattered glass. Beside her, the warrior lay unmoving, breath shallow and uneven. The storm swallowed what remained of the day, plunging the world into an early gray twilight. Elowen knew she had no time to waste. She gathered what little driftwood lay near the cave mouth, brittle tumbleweed and twisted mesquite roots, and struck her flint. The fire caught, sputtering weakly at first. Then it bloomed, a small, defiant flame throwing orange light against the closing dark. Its glow danced across Tarek's face. He was younger than she'd thought, maybe 26. His features sharp, carved from the same granite as the ridges beyond the cave. Yet fever softened them now, leaving him looking strangely, unexpectedly vulnerable. But it was his leg that demanded her focus. The buckskin trousers were soaked nearly black, stiff with mud and blood. Elowen dropped to her knees beside him, her hands shaking despite her effort to steady them. She wasn't a nurse. She had been raised to pour tea, to stitch neat patterns into linen, to live quietly behind lace curtains. Yet as she studied the swollen, angry wound before her, she understood something with sudden clarity. The girl who embroidered pillowcases had been left behind somewhere on the trail. She reached for the knife at her belt, the small paring blade she had stolen from her own kitchen. Drawing a slow breath, she sliced into the thick leather of his pant leg, cutting it open and peeling it back. The damage was brutal. The bullet had torn straight through the muscle of his thigh. Raw, ragged, still bleeding. It needed binding, now. Elowen glanced down at herself. Her riding dress was drenched, caked with flood silt, heavy and useless. She slid her hands beneath the soaked skirt and found the hem of her petticoat. Fine white cotton, trimmed with delicate lace, shipped all the way from St. Louis, meant for parlors and polished floors, for a life of quiet suffocation. She wrapped her fingers into the fabric and pulled. The rip echoed through the small cave, sharp and final, like something being severed. She tore it again, and again, strip after strip, destroying the last symbol of her former life to save the life of a stranger. "This is going to hurt," she whispered. He could not hear her. Still, she pressed the clean cotton firmly against the wound. The response was instant. Tarek's eyes snapped open. They were no longer dull with fever or drifting toward death. They were sharp, focused, dangerous. The eyes of a predator awakened in its den. He didn't cry out. He moved. His hand shot up and clamped around Eloan's wrist like iron. He twisted hard, yanking her forward until her face hovered inches from his. He snarled something in a language she didn't understand, his free hand clawing blindly for a knife that wasn't there. "Who are you?" he rasped in English, the words jagged with pain. "Soldier? Hunter?" Eloan's heart slammed against her ribs like a trapped bird. She saw the violence coiled inside him, the instinct to kill, to survive at any cost. But she didn't pull away. She didn't scream. She met his gaze, those dark eyes blazing with fever, and held her ground. "I'm not a soldier," she said. Her voice trembled, but her chin stayed lifted. "And I'm not a hunter." His grip tightened, searching her face for a lie. "Then why are you here?" "Because I'm the reason you didn't drown in that wash," she snapped back, sharper than she meant. "I'm the reason you're still breathing. Now lie still." It was not a plea. It was an order. Tarek stared at her, pain and confusion warring behind his eyes. His gaze dropped to her wrist, caught in his grasp, then to the white lace bandage pressed against his leg, already blooming red. Slowly, the tension left his arm. His fingers loosened, falling away and leaving pale marks on her skin. He let his head sink back against the stone. His breath shuddered. "Water," he whispered. Eloan exhaled, a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Yes," she said softly. "Water." She lifted her canteen and brought it to his lips. Time inside the cave did not move by hours. It moved by the storm. For 2 days, rain battered the canyon without mercy, a relentless curtain sealing the cave mouth and turning their shelter into a world of its own. Outside, the land dissolved into mud and chaos. Inside, there was only fire, shadows, and silence. Yet silence, Eloan learned, carried its own language. For the first day, Tarek slept, his body locked in battle with infection. Eloan kept the fire alive, feeding it patiently. She watched the cave entrance without blinking, the Winchester she'd pulled from his saddle scabbard resting across her knees. Waiting, listening, guarding the thin line between life and death. She studied him in the firelight. All her life she had been taught that men like him were savages, godless creatures who lived for violence, who killed without reason or mercy. Yet as she watched Tarek sleep, she saw something else entirely. Even in fevered rest, his hands moved with care. His possessions were kept close, arranged by instinct rather than thought. A small medicine pouch rested against his chest. The beadwork on his moccasins was detailed and deliberate, each stitch placed with meaning. These were not the signs of a monster. They were the marks of a man who belonged to something, a people, a history, a family. By the second afternoon, the fever finally broke. Tarek woke with clear eyes, though his body remained weak as a newborn colt. He braced himself against the cave wall, breathing shallowly as strength returned inch by inch. His gaze followed Eloan as she moved near the fire. He watched her hands. They were scraped raw, fingernails cracked, skin rubbed sore by cold and stone. Yet they did not tremble. She wasn't ringing them in fear. She was checking the rifle's priming, counting what remained of their dried apples, moving with careful purpose. It was a rhythm he recognized, the rhythm of someone who intended to live. "You're not from the town," he said. It wasn't a question. Eowyn looked up, startled by the sound of his voice. "I was," she answered. "Until 2 days ago." Tarek shook his head slightly. "Town women don't know how to bank a fire so it holds through the night. They don't know how to sit still." She stirred the tin cup, warming over the coals. "Need teaches fast." He studied her for a moment longer, then asked quietly, "Why did you stop?" She glanced up. "Stop? You had a horse. You had the high ground. You could have left me to the flood." Eowyn stared into the flames. "I suppose I could have." "Then why didn't you?" She turned to face him. "Because a life is a life." "Even the life of an enemy?" A dry chuckle slipped from him, not mocking, only tired. "Is that what I am?" he asked. "An enemy? That's what the papers in Tucson say." He reached into his tunic and withdrew a small bundle wrapped in oiled hide. "The papers say I eat children, that I burn churches." He held the packet up between them. "Do you know what this is?" Eowyn shook her head. "A treaty," he said. "Words on paper. Promises." He lowered it slowly, resting his hand over his heart. "I was carrying it to the commander of the Lowell border troop, to keep the soldiers from riding into my village, to protect the women and the old ones who cannot run." He met her eyes. "I am not a killer, Eowyn Price. I am a shield." His voice roughened. "I was trying to stop a war, not begin one." She stared at him, stunned. Everything she had been taught, every tale of bloodthirsty savages, cracked apart. In its place stood a man who had ridden into gunfire, not for pride or glory, but to save his family. A negotiator, a protector, a man of honor. "I didn't know," she whispered. "We rarely do," he said quietly, "about those we're taught to hate." The moment settled heavy between them. The cave seemed smaller. The firelight flickered, pulling their shadows together on the stone wall. They were two outcasts now, stripped of labels and fear. No settler, no warrior, just a man and a woman keeping the cold away. Later that evening, the storm finally softened to a steady drizzle. Testing his strength, Tarek dragged himself towards the cave mouth. Using a length of rawhide and a bent sapling, he set a simple snare. Within the hour, he returned with a desert cottontail. The smell of roasting meat filled the cave, rich and savory, making Eowyn's stomach tighten with hunger she hadn't realized she'd been ignoring. She had given him nearly all of the dried apples. Tarek pulled the rabbit from the fire and worked his knife carefully, hands steady despite the pain in his leg. He cut away the saddle, the most tender portion. He held it out to her on the tip of the blade. She hesitated. "You need your strength," he said. "You lost blood. Take it." She reached for the meat. As she did, her sleeve slid up her forearm. Firelight caught the bruises, dark purple and yellow marks shaped like fingers, the ghost of a man's grip, the mark of ownership she had fled. Tarek froze. Eowyn froze with him. The cave fell silent, the fire snapping softly as the truth hung between them. She noticed his gaze drop to her wrist. Heat rushed to her face, shame rising on instinct. The urge to pull her hand back came fast, to hide the marks, to conceal the proof of what had been done to her. But Tarek said nothing. He didn't ask who hurt you. He didn't ask, is this why you ran? He didn't force her to drag the humiliation back into the open with words. Instead, his eyes lifted to meet hers. They had softened, deepened, filled with quiet understanding. He saw the bruises, and somehow he read the entire story without a single question being spoken. He understood she had been fighting her own war. He understood she, too, had survived violence. Slowly, he turned the knife in his hand and pressed the handle gently into her palm, guiding the food toward her. "Eat," he said softly. "You've come a long way to be free." It was more than an offering. It was recognition. Among the Stone-Wind people, the finest cut of meat was given to the warrior who had endured the hardest battle, or to the guest held in the highest honor. Eowyn accepted it. Her throat tightened, eyes burning, not with sorrow, but with the sudden, overwhelming relief of being seen. For the first time in her life, a man looked at her bruises and did not see weakness. He saw a fellow survivor. She nodded, unable to speak, and took a bite. And in the quiet of the cave, as the storm finally loosened its grip outside, something unbreakable formed between them, stronger than iron, deeper than blood. When the sun returned, it did not rise gently. It split the horizon wide open, pouring gold across the canyon walls. In the high desert, a storm is always a promise, and the water that had nearly killed them now worked a miracle. Where dust and thorn had ruled before, life erupted overnight. Desert verbena and poppies spread across the land in waves of purple and fire orange. Damp sand breathed out the sweet scent of creosote and wet sage. It looked like paradise. But beauty in this country often hides danger beneath its skin. Tarek was the first to sense it. He sat near the cave mouth, checking the action on the Winchester. His leg was stiff, wrapped tightly in strips torn from Eowyn's petticoat, but the fever had burned itself away. He went still, his head tilted slightly towards the east. "Horses," he said under his breath. Eowyn had been wringing water from her dress by the fire. She froze. "Are you sure?" "Iron shoes on stone," he replied, eyes narrowing. "Not wild." He eased himself forward, staying low behind the scrub oak near the ridge edge. Eowyn crawled beside him. Below them, the canyon floor twisted with shadow and early light, and cutting through it were two drifting plumes of dust. From the north came 3 riders, moving fast, rifles resting easy across their saddles. The Iron Hollow men. They had circled back once the rain erased the trail. Then Tarek pointed south. Eowyn followed his gaze, and her blood turned cold. 4 men threaded their way through the boulders. She recognized the lead rider instantly. Not Alton Reeves. He was too much of a coward to ride into Badlands himself. But his foreman was there. Garin Pike. The scar above his lip was unmistakable. His eyes had never held anything but contempt for her. "They found us," she whispered. "They found both of us," Tarek corrected quietly. They watched as the 2 groups reached the same clearing. For a moment, it looked like they might turn on each other. Rifles lifted, pistols cleared leather. Harsh voices echoed off the canyon walls. Then Garin Pike pointed toward the ridge, sketching the shape of a woman in the air. One of the Iron Hollow men laughed and spat into the dirt. He gestured north, miming a hanging. A bargain was made. A handshake sealed it. Tarek lowered his head. "The wolf and the snake," he murmured. "They've decided to hunt together." He looked at Eowyn. "I can't run," he said. "Not on this leg. Not fast enough to outride 7 men on fresh horses." "I'm not leaving you," Eowyn said. The words carried the same iron stubbornness she'd shown in the flood. "Eowyn, listen!" But she was already shaking her head. "Not now, not again." Tarek spoke fast now, urgency sharpening his voice as he gripped her shoulder. "They want the treaty," he said. "They want my scalp. If you leave now—" "They want you," Eowyn cut in. Her voice shook, but there was fire in it. "That foreman has orders to drag me back, alive or dead, and I don't think he cares which anymore." "If you run, they'll catch you," Tarek said. "If you stay, they'll kill you." She met his eyes. "Then we're tied together, Tarek. We stand or we fall." He searched her face. The fear was there, clear as daylight. But beneath it was something harder. Steel. She wasn't the girl who once stitched pillows in quiet rooms. She was the woman who had hauled him from a flood and refused to let him die. "Then we make them regret ever finding us," he said. The plan grew from desperation and from stone. The trail leading up to the cave narrowed into a tight passage carved between two towering slabs of granite. Steep, choked with loose shale and scree. No horse could climb it. A man would have to come up single file. "It's a funnel," Tarek explained, drawing lines in the dirt with a stick. "They have numbers, but the land favors us. They can only come one at a time." He drew his hunting knife from his belt. The blade was thick, hammered from old steel, the handle wrapped in worn leather darkened by years of use. He offered it to her. "Do you know how to use this?" Elowen stared at it. "I've cut vegetables." "This isn't a vegetable," he said grimly. He took her hand and placed the hilt into her palm, adjusting her grip carefully. His hands were rough, warm, steady. "Don't slash," he instructed, guiding the motion. "Slashing comes from fear." He shifted her wrist. "You push, up and in, under the ribs." He looked straight into her eyes. "If they're close enough for this, you don't hesitate. You don't think about who they are. You strike. To live." She swallowed, feeling the weight of the blade settle into her bones. "I understand." "Good. Now," he pointed toward a massive slab of sandstone perched near the edge of the shelf, undercut by centuries of wind. "Take the high ground, behind that boulder. I'll draw them in." The waiting was the hardest part. The sun climbed higher, baking the rock until the canyon felt like an oven. Heat shimmered. Cicadas buzzed. Silence stretched tight, thin as a wire ready to snap. Then came the sound. Boots. Tarek lay flat behind a fallen log near the cave mouth, the Winchester braced across the wood. He breathed slow and deep, forcing his heart to settle. The first hat appeared over the rise. One of the Iron Hollow men. Tarek didn't wait. He squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked like thunder inside the canyon. The man cried out, spinning backward, clutching his shoulder. "Get down!" someone shouted below. The canyon exploded. Bullets sparked off stone, whining like angry hornets. Tarek stayed low, working the lever smoothly. Click-clack. Boom. Click-clack. Boom. He wasn't trying to kill. He was hurting them, forcing them forward. "Push up, he's reloading," Garen Pike shouted. 4 men charged the slope, scrambling over loose rock, slipping and swearing. They were confident. They believed there was only one wounded man with one rifle. They never looked up. High above them, Elowen Price braced her shoulder against the fulcrum. Tarek had shown her the wedge stone jammed beneath the massive boulder. She was not strong in the way men measured strength. She couldn't lift barrels or break horses. But she understood leverage. She understood that when pressure met the right point, even mountains could be persuaded to move. Below her, men shouted. The canyon waited. She saw the tops of their heads as they rushed toward Tarek. Elowen shut her eyes. She thought of the cage she had escaped, the walls of silk and fear, the life that had tried to claim her. And she pushed. She drove with her legs, with her back, with everything inside her. The small wedge stone groaned beneath the pressure. It shifted an inch, then another. Crack! The sound split the canyon like a cannon blast. The massive boulder tipped forward, hovering in the air for one breathless moment, then surrendered to gravity. It didn't fall alone. The hillside followed. Shale, dust, and heavy stone thundered down the chute. Men screamed below as the earth itself came loose. The avalanche swallowed the trail. 2 attackers were ripped from their footing, hurled backward and rolled down the slope in a choking cloud of brown dust. The others dove for cover, blinded and gasping. For a heartbeat, everything went still. Then, through the drifting haze, a shape moved. Garen Pike. He hadn't been caught in the slide. While the others distracted Tarek, he had climbed the jagged rock face, working his way along the flank. Now he hauled himself onto the ledge, barely 10 feet from where Elowen stood. Dust coated him gray. Blood streaked his split lip. His eyes burned with pure rage. "You little witch!" he hissed. He raised his heavy Colt revolver, leveling it straight at her chest. Elowen had the knife, but she was 20 feet away. "Don't move," he sneered. "Drop it, or I drop you." Below them, Tarek lay on the ground. His rifle was empty. He saw Garen Pike. He saw the gun aimed at Elowen. He didn't think. He didn't measure the distance or test his wounded leg. He roared, a sound of raw defiance, and launched himself forward. He couldn't run, but he could lunge. He threw his body between Garen Pike and Elowen at the exact instant the revolver fired. The shot slammed into Tarek's shoulder, spinning him sideways as he crashed into the foreman's legs. Both men went down hard, rolling in the dirt, a knot of fury, blood, and desperation. Garen Pike was bigger, stronger, unhurt. He drove a fist into Tarek's wounded side, ripping a cry of pain from his chest. Then he kicked him away and scrambled upright, lifting the revolver again for the killing shot. He forgot about Elowen, forgot she wasn't just watching anymore. She didn't scream. Adrenaline flooded her veins, stretching the world into slow motion. She saw his back, saw his thumb pull the hammer. She didn't use the knife. She used the land. Elowen seized a heavy ironwood branch from the firewood pile, dense as steel, and swung it with both hands as if splitting a root. The impact cracked through the canyon. Bone gave way. The revolver flew from Garen Pike's hand, skittering over the cliff edge. He screamed, clutching his shattered wrist, stumbling backward toward the drop. He looked at Elowen, truly looked at her, and what he saw made him recoil. There was death in her eyes. He didn't wait to see what she would do next. He scrambled backward, sliding down the scree slope, tumbling end over end until he struck the canyon floor below. He ran for his horse. Before he could even mount, the other men were already fleeing. Rock slide. Sniper fire. A madwoman on the ridge. It was far more trouble than any paycheck promised. They turned their horses and galloped away, dust swallowing them whole. Silence returned to the canyon. But this time it wasn't threatening. It was heavy, the ringing stillness that follows violence. Dust drifted in the sunlight, golden motes floating through the air. Elowen let the ironwood branch fall. Her hands shook so badly she had to clasp them together to still the tremor. She turned toward Tarek. He lay on his back, breathing hard, one hand pressed against his bleeding shoulder. His face was pale, battered, covered in gray dust, the mark of a fight neither of them should have survived. Elowen dropped to her knees beside him. "Tarek!" His eyes fluttered open, pain twisted his face, then slowly eased into a crooked, uneven grin. "You have," he breathed, "a very strong swing." A sound tore from her chest, half laugh, half sob, as she leaned over him. She checked his shoulder quickly. The bullet had punched clean through the muscle. Bloody. Agonizing. But it had missed bone and lung. He would live. "You jumped," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You jumped in front of a gun." "You dropped a mountain," he answered softly. He lifted his good hand, fingers streaked with dust and powder, and brushed a smear of dirt from her cheek. "I told you," he murmured. "Partners." Elowen leaned closer. She didn't kiss him. That would have been too small for what they had survived. Instead, she rested her forehead against his. They stayed there a long while, breathing, sharing the same air, dust, sage, and the sharp metallic scent of blood. His warmth pressed against her skin. She felt the steady rhythm of his heart, echoing her own. No treaty was signed there, no vow spoken. The bond was already sealed, forged in floodwater, tempered by fire. They were no longer two souls fleeing their pasts. They were two people who had claimed their future. Tarek closed his eyes and let out a long, trembling breath against her skin. "We're still alive." "Yes," Elowen whispered, closing her eyes as relief washed through her. "We're still alive." They rode on in silence. Only the steady crunch of Ember's hooves on hardpan broke the stillness, along with the dry whistle of wind through mesquite. They were battered, bruised, coated in the dust of a fight that should have killed them both. But they were moving. By late afternoon, they reached the edge of the canyon country. Here, the land opened wide, vast and unforgiving, a place of decision, a place where the earth itself seemed to ask, "Who are you? And where are you going?" Tarek signaled for her to stop. He slid from the saddle, landing heavily and favoring his wounded leg. His jaw tightened as pain flared. He wiped sweat from his eyes and stepped to Ember's head, stroking her nose. But his gaze stayed fixed on the horizon. "This is the place," he said, voice rough with exhaustion. He pointed east toward the rising sun. "The fort lies a day's ride that way. I'll take the treaty to the commander of the Lowell border troop. I'll keep my word to my people." Then he turned and pointed west, toward the endless stretch of gold and violet fading into the distance. "That way leads to the coast, to towns where no one knows your name, cities where a woman can vanish." He looked up at her. "You could be free there, Elowen Price." She sat tall in the saddle, following the line of his hand. The West. It was what she had wanted, wasn't it? Only 3 days earlier, she had stolen a horse and ridden straight into a storm just to reach that horizon. It meant safety, a life without fear, without forced vows, without war. The road was wide, simple, and unbearably lonely. She looked down at the man standing beside her stirrup. He was dust-covered, bleeding, still hunted. His path led back to a world that might never welcome her, to a conflict that wasn't hers, to a life as hard as the stone beneath their boots. Her eyes fell to her wrists. The bruises left by Alton Reeves were fading now, yellowed like old parchment. But the memory of Tarek's hand, the one that had pulled her from the flood, the one that had steadied her in the dark, was still warm. And in that moment, she understood something, at last. Freedom wasn't a direction on a map. It wasn't a city in California. Freedom, she realized, wasn't a place on the horizon. It was the feeling of standing beside someone who had seen your deepest scars and chosen not to turn away. Elowen did not look west again. Slowly, with intention, she slipped her boot from the stirrup and stepped down into the dust, standing face to face with him as the wind curled around her skirts. She took the reins from his hand. "You can't walk to the fort on that leg," she said quietly. "Not if you plan on reaching it before winter." Tarek frowned, confusion clouding his dark eyes. "You should go," he said. "The West." "I've changed my mind," she cut in gently. She placed the leather reins back into his palm, folding his fingers closed around them. "I can't let you die out here after everything I did to keep you alive." A pause. Then she added, almost smiling, "It would be a shame to waste good lace." Understanding crept across his face. He looked at the reins, then back at her. For just a moment, the warrior's mask slipped, revealing hope he hadn't dared to carry. "My village lies north," he said softly. "Life there is hard. Winters are long." Elowen smiled. It was the first real smile she'd worn in years, one that reached her eyes, easing the tight lines of fear, lighting her face like sunrise after a storm. "I hear the north is beautiful this time of year," she replied. Tarek didn't argue. He didn't try to be noble anymore. He simply nodded, accepting the gift she was offering. He mounted Ember carefully, wincing as he settled his injured leg. Then he reached down, not with a cautious hand, but with his arms, strong, steady, unbreakable. Elowen took them. She swung up behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist, pressing her cheek against the rough buckskin of his shirt. She breathed in rain, sage, and the man beneath her. They did not ride west toward safety. They turned the horse north, into the wind, into the unknown. They rode toward a future without maps, uncertain, unforgiving, but for the first time in their lives, they were not riding alone. And so the fire burns low to embers. The night settles quietly around us. They began as strangers, as enemies, separated by fear, history, and the lies of the world. But pain has a way of stripping away the titles we wear like armor. In the darkness of that cave, emptied of the past, they were no longer settler and warrior, no longer fugitive and protector. They were simply two souls seeking warmth in a cold land. You know, as the years pass, we are often told to stay with our own kind, to fear what we do not understand, to walk only the safe, well-worn path. We are taught that security is the highest virtue, but Elowen and Tarek remind us of something deeper. Sometimes the wrong turn is the only one that leads to the right life. Sometimes the map we've been following was drawn by people who never knew who we truly were. And maybe, just maybe, you're facing a storm of your own right now. Maybe the waters are rising. Maybe you feel trapped inside a life that no longer fits. If that's you, I hope you remember this story. Remember that strength often appears when we feel weakest. That help may come from the person you least expect. Love is not always convenient. It is rarely clean. Sometimes it is covered in dust, mud, and torn lace. But if it is real, if it makes you braver than you were before, then it is worth the fight. It is worth the risk of riding into the unknown. Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. Thank you for listening and for allowing this story to speak to your heart. The Wild West still holds countless truths, some painful, some tender, all worth remembering. Stay with us, subscribe, comment, and invite others to discover these untamed stories. From our hearts to yours, thank you for being part of this journey. Aviso legal barra disclaimer. Each story shared here is produced for storytelling enjoyment. Certain scenes may include fictional or dramatized elements inspired by historical circumstances. Although AI tools assist us in visuals, narration, and script development, the emotional tone, editing, and quality control are conducted by people to ensure meaningful experiences. We fully uphold YouTube's policies, using no deceptive recreations or impersonations of real individuals. All creative resources are properly licensed. Unauthorized copying, re-uploading, or remixing is not permitted. Thank you for supporting the effort behind every episode we create.